Sometimes the things people throw away still have fight left in them. Sometimes a father's love can breathe life into what everyone else calls dead. On a dusty military runway sat an old F-16 that nobody wanted. Troy Matheson, a single dad who spent his days fixing jets for other men to fly, looked at that beaten-up fighter and saw possibility. For 15 years, he'd watched pilots half his age take off in newer aircraft while he stayed grounded. But when his 8-year-old daughter asked why he never got to fly like the others, something stirred in his chest. The squadron laughed when Troy asked to test the old jet. They called it junk, a waste of time, impossible to fly. Troy didn't argue with them. He climbed into that cockpit, flipped the switches, and fired up engines that hadn't run in 2 years. What happened next shocked everyone on that base. But would this flight be enough to keep the promise he made to his dying wife? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Nellis Air Force Base as Troy Matheson walked the flight line, his worn work boots crunching against the tarmac. At 43, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who'd learned to find purpose in the spaces between dreams and reality. His weathered hands, stained with years of hydraulic fluid and engine grease, told the story of countless hours spent breathing life into machines that others would pilot into glory. In his wallet, tucked behind his base ID, sat a photograph that had traveled with him for 8 years. The image showed him and Rebecca on their wedding day, her pilot's wings gleaming against her dress uniform. On the back, in her careful handwriting, were the words that had both sustained and haunted him: "Fly for both of us." She'd written it during her final days in the hospital, when the cancer had taken her voice, but not her spirit. Troy paused beside the old F-16 that had become his daily companion. Serial number 84-75 had been manufactured in 1984, the same year he'd first soloed in a Cessna 172. The fighter had seen better decades. Its grey paint was faded and chipped, revealing patches of primer underneath. Most of the squadron walked past it without a second glance. Their attention focused on the newer F-35s that represented the future of aerial warfare, but Troy saw something different when he looked at 1275. He saw the graceful lines that had made the Fighting Falcon a legend, the engineering marvel that had proven itself in conflicts around the world. More importantly, he saw potential that others had written off too quickly. "Morning, beautiful," he murmured to the aircraft, running his hand along its wing. It was a ritual he'd developed over the years, this quiet conversation with machines that couldn't talk back but somehow understood. Let's see what kind of trouble we can get into today. The hangar buzzed with its usual morning activity. Younger airmen moved with the confident energy of those who believed the best years lay ahead, while the seasoned non-commissioned officers carried themselves with the measured pace of men who'd learned that most problems could be solved with patience and the right tools. Troy's workspace occupied a corner of the main hangar, organized with the meticulous care of someone who'd spent 2 decades maintaining aircraft. Every tool had its place, every manual was properly indexed, and every maintenance log was completed with the kind of thoroughness that saved lives. His colleagues respected his expertise, even if they sometimes forgot he'd once worn pilot's wings himself. The reason for his transition from cockpit to hangar was a story he rarely told in full. 15 years ago, during a routine training exercise, a hydraulic failure had forced him to make an emergency landing that saved both his life and the aircraft. The investigation cleared him of any wrongdoing, but the incident had shaken his confidence in ways that weren't immediately apparent. When Rebecca became pregnant with their daughter, he'd made what seemed like the practical choice, transferring to maintenance to ensure he'd always come home. At 8 years old, Lily possessed her mother's curious nature and her father's mechanical intuition. She could name every aircraft on the base and understood the basics of jet propulsion better than most high school students. When she visited the hangar after school, she'd pepper Troy with questions that revealed an intellect that would have made Rebecca proud. "Dad, why don't you fly anymore?" she'd asked the previous week, her small hands tracing the outline of a wrench on his workbench. It was the kind of innocent question that children asked without understanding its power to reopen old wounds. Troy had given her the same answer he'd rehearsed for years, that he preferred fixing jets to flying them, that someone had to keep the plane safe for the pilots. But lately that explanation felt increasingly hollow, even to him. The squadron's current commanding officer, Major William Brennan, represented everything Troy might have become if circumstances had been different. Brennan was competent, confident, and completely convinced that the old F-16 was beyond salvage. He'd made his position clear during the previous month's maintenance briefing. 1275 was scheduled for decommissioning, and any resources spent on it were considered wasteful, Matheson, Brennan had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. "I need you to focus on aircraft that actually contribute to our mission readiness. That old bird is headed for the boneyard, and no amount of wishful thinking is going to change that." Troy had nodded respectfully, but something in Rebecca's memory had stirred. She'd never accepted defeat gracefully, and her spirit seemed to whisper that some fights were worth having regardless of the odds. The other pilots treated Troy with polite professionalism, but there was an unspoken distance that separated those who flew from those who maintained. Captain James Tucker, the squadron's most decorated aviator, had a particular talent for making Troy feel invisible. Tucker's achievements were impressive. Combat missions in 3 theaters, instructor pilot certification, and a reputation for handling the most challenging aircraft assignments. Yet Troy remembered when Tucker had been a nervous second lieutenant, struggling with night landings and radio procedures. The young pilot who'd once sought Troy's advice had evolved into someone who seemed to have forgotten those early days of uncertainty. Master Sergeant Carlos Hernandez provided a bridge between the worlds of maintenance and operations. At 55, he'd seen enough changes in military aviation to understand that experience often mattered more than rank. Hernandez had flown with Rebecca during her final tour, and he carried memories of her skill and courage that made him protective of her family. She was something special, Hernandez had told Troy during one of their rare private conversations. Used to say that every aircraft had its own personality, and the secret was learning to listen. Said 1275 was her favorite because it never quit fighting, even when everything went wrong. Those words had planted a seed that grew stronger each day. Troy spent maintaining the old fighter. Rebecca had logged over 200 hours in that specific aircraft, and her maintenance notes revealed an intimate knowledge of its systems and capabilities. She documented modifications and improvements that weren't in the official records. Small changes that had enhanced the aircraft's performance in ways that only she and Troy fully understood. The base itself felt like a living museum of aviation history. Nellis had trained generations of pilots, from World War II veterans to modern aviators preparing for conflicts that hadn't yet been imagined. The weight of that legacy was both inspiring and intimidating for someone who'd chosen to step away from the cockpit. As the morning progressed and the Nevada sun climbed higher, Troy found himself drawn repeatedly to 1275. Each inspection revealed details that others had missed. Systems that were functioning better than expected, components that showed wear but remained serviceable, and an overall condition that defied the pessimistic assessments of those who'd written it off. Rebecca's presence seemed strongest near the aircraft she'd loved, and Troy could almost hear her voice, encouraging him to see beyond the surface damage to the potential that lay beneath. The afternoon heat shimmered off the tarmac as Troy completed his final inspection of the day. He was securing his tools when he noticed Lily walking across the flight line, her small backpack bouncing with each determined step. She wasn't supposed to be on the airfield without an escort, but the security guards had grown accustomed to the base mechanic's daughter and her uncanny ability to navigate military protocols. "Dad!" she called out, her voice carrying across the open space. There was something different in her tone, not the usual excitement of sharing school stories, but an urgency that made Troy set down his wrench and give her his full attention. She reached him slightly out of breath, her cheeks flushed from the desert heat. In her small hands, she clutched something that made Troy's heart skip, a pair of pilot's wings, polished to a bright silver gleam. He recognized them immediately as the wings Rebecca had worn during her final flight. The ones he'd given to Lily years ago when she'd asked what made her mother special. Mrs. Patterson asked everyone in class to bring something that showed what our parents do for work, Lily said, her words tumbling together in the way children spoke when trying to explain something important. "I brought these and told everyone my dad is a pilot like my mom was." Troy knelt down to meet her eyes, seeing Rebecca's determined expression reflected in their daughter's face. "Lily, you know I work on airplanes. I don't fly them anymore." "But you could," she said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "You have pilot wings too. I've seen them in your drawer. Why don't you use them?" Before Troy could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Major Brennan appeared, flanked by Captain Tucker and 2 other pilots returning from a training exercise. Their flight suits bore the sweat stains and satisfied expressions of men who'd spent the afternoon doing what they loved most. "Matheson," Brennan said, his voice carrying its usual authoritative tone. "Your daughter shouldn't be on the flight line unescorted." "Yes, sir. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Troy started to guide Lily toward the hangar, but she pulled away with the stubborn independence she'd inherited from both parents. "My dad can fly that plane," she announced, pointing toward the old F-16. "He's just as good as you are." The pilots exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of maintenance personnel who harbored flying ambitions. Tucker's smirk was particularly cutting, the expression of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be underestimated. "Is that so?" Brennan asked, his tone suggesting amusement rather than genuine interest. "And what makes you think your father could handle a fighter aircraft?" Lily straightened her shoulders in a gesture Troy recognized from countless arguments with Rebecca. "Because my mom taught him everything she knew, and she was the best pilot on this base." The comment hit its mark. Rebecca's reputation had been legendary, and even Brennan had to acknowledge her skill. But his expression remained skeptical as he turned his attention to Troy. "I wasn't aware you had current flight status, Matheson." "I don't, sir," Troy admitted, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. "My daughter sometimes gets carried away with her imagination." "I see." Brennan's gaze shifted to the old F-16, then back to Troy. "For what it's worth, that aircraft is scheduled for decommissioning next month. The maintenance costs exceed any possible operational value." Tucker stepped forward, unable to resist adding his perspective. "No offense, Matheson, but there's a big difference between turning wrenches and pulling G's. That old bird requires a pilot who understands modern combat systems, not someone who's been playing in the motor pool for 15 years. The comment landed like a physical blow. Troy felt Lily stiffen beside him, her small hand finding his larger one. In that moment, he could almost hear Rebecca's voice cutting through the years. "Don't let them define what you're capable of. Troy, you're better than they know. I understand the distinction." "Captain," Troy replied quietly, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "I've maintained aircraft that you've flown, and I know every system in that F-16 better than anyone on this base. Knowing systems and flying them are completely different things," Tucker pressed, emboldened by what he perceived as weakness. "That aircraft needs a real pilot, not someone who's forgotten what it feels like to leave the ground." The gathering crowd of airmen created an amphitheater of judgment. Some watched with the uncomfortable fascination reserved for public humiliation, while others seemed genuinely curious about how the confrontation would resolve. Troy could feel the weight of their expectations, the unspoken assumption that he would back down gracefully and accept his place in the hierarchy. But Lily squeezed his hand, and in that small gesture, He felt the strength that had carried Rebecca through her own battles against doubt and discrimination. She'd faced similar challenges in a male-dominated profession, proving herself through skill and determination rather than accepting the limitations others tried to impose. "You're right, Captain," Troy said finally, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Knowing systems and flying them are different things, but I've done both, and I remember exactly what it feels like to leave the ground." Brennan raised an eyebrow, perhaps sensing that the conversation had moved beyond simple boasting. "Are you suggesting you could actually fly that aircraft?" Troy looked down at his daughter, seeing Rebecca's unwavering faith reflected in her eyes. 8 years of playing it safe, 8 years of accepting other people's definitions of his capabilities, 8 years of honoring his wife's memory by hiding from the dreams they'd shared. "I'm not suggesting anything." "Sir," Troy said, straightening to his full height, "I'm requesting permission to conduct a test flight of aircraft 84-1275. The silence that followed was profound. Tucker's smirk faded into genuine surprise, while Brennan's expression shifted from amusement to something approaching concern. "That's not how it works, Matheson," Brennan said carefully. "Flight authorizations require current certifications, medical clearances, and command approval. You can't just decide to take a joyride in military equipment." "I'm not talking about a joyride," Troy replied, feeling the momentum of decision carrying him forward. "I'm talking about a comprehensive evaluation of an aircraft that everyone has written off without proper assessment. If I can demonstrate that 1275 is flight-worthy, perhaps the decommissioning order should be reconsidered." Tucker laughed, the sound harsh in the desert air. "You're serious? You actually think you can climb into that wreck and prove something to us?" Troy felt Lily's grip tighten on his hand, felt the weight of Rebecca's wings in his pocket, felt the accumulated frustration of 15 years spent on the sidelines, while others flew the aircraft he'd lovingly maintained. "I think," he said quietly, "that aircraft has more fight left in it than anyone realizes. And I think it's time someone gave it a chance to prove what it can do." The challenge was issued, hanging in the air between them like an unexploded ordnance. Troy had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, made a statement that would require action to validate. Around them, the assembled airmen waited to see how their leadership would respond to a maintenance chief who dared to claim equality with the pilots he served. That evening, as the base settled into its nighttime quiet, Troy found himself drawn back to the hangar. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the aircraft that stood like sleeping giants in the cavernous space. He'd sent Lily home with the Hernandez family, needing time to process the afternoon's confrontation and its implications. The old F-16 sat in its designated spot, looking more forlorn than usual under the artificial lighting. Troy approached it with the reverence of a pilgrim visiting a shrine, carrying the heavy maintenance manual that had become his constant companion over the past 15 years. The book's pages were filled with his own annotations, notes about system quirks, performance modifications, and the kind of intimate mechanical knowledge that could only be gained through years of dedicated attention. He'd first opened this manual as a young staff sergeant, eager to prove himself worthy of working on the most advanced fighters in the Air Force inventory. Back then, the technical specifications had seemed like a foreign language, full of acronyms and procedures that required intense study to understand. Now those same pages read like familiar poetry, each system description triggering memories of specific repairs and improvements he'd implemented over the years. Rebecca had encouraged his attention to detail, recognizing that his mechanical intuition complemented her piloting skills in ways that made them an exceptional team. She'd often said that pilots who understood their aircraft at the component level were the ones who survived when everything went wrong. And she'd pushed him to think beyond routine maintenance toward genuine system mastery. Troy settled into his work chair and began a systematic review of 1275's maintenance history. The aircraft's logbook told a story of steady service and gradual decline, but it also revealed patterns that others had missed. The previous maintenance crews had focused on addressing immediate problems without considering the broader implications of their repairs. Small issues had been bandaged rather than solved, leading to cascading failures that made the aircraft appear less reliable than it actually was. As he worked deeper into the records, Troy began to understand why everyone had written off the old fighter. The cumulative effect of quick fixes and deferred maintenance had created a reputation for unreliability that wasn't entirely deserved. More importantly, he realized that many of the aircraft's supposed limitations were actually the result of outdated procedures rather than fundamental mechanical problems. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his concentration. Master Sergeant Hernandez appeared in the hangar entrance, moving with the careful stealth of someone who'd learned to navigate military facilities without attracting unwanted attention. "Figured I'd find you here," Hernandez said, settling into a nearby chair with the casual ease of an old friend. "Lily's doing homework at our place. My wife made enough dinner for an extra mouth if you want to join us later." Troy nodded his appreciation while continuing to scan the maintenance logs. "Carlos, what do you remember about Rebecca's flights in this aircraft?" Hernandez leaned back, his expression growing thoughtful. "She loved that old bird more than any of the newer jets. Used to say it had personality, that it would talk to you if you knew how to listen." "Why do you ask?" "I'm trying to understand why everyone thinks it's unflyable. The maintenance records show problems, but nothing that can't be addressed with proper attention. You're really serious about this test flight idea, aren't you?" Troy set down the manual and looked directly at his old friend. "When Rebecca was dying, she made me promise to keep flying for both of us. I've spent 8 years telling myself that maintaining aircraft was enough, that I was honoring her memory by keeping other pilots in the air. But today, when Lily asked why I don't fly anymore, I realized I'd been hiding instead of living." Hernandez nodded slowly, understanding the weight of such admissions. "What does Brennan say about your request?" "He hasn't given me an official answer yet. I think he's hoping I'll come to my senses and withdraw the request before he has to deal with the paperwork. And if he denies it?" Troy considered the question carefully. The smart play would be to accept rejection gracefully, return to his normal duties, and pretend the afternoon's confrontation had never happened. But Rebecca's voice seemed to whisper from the shadows, reminding him that the safe choice wasn't always the right choice. "Then I'll find another way," he said finally. "This aircraft deserves better than the scrapyard, and I deserve to know if I still remember how to fly." Hernandez studied his friend with the calculating gaze of someone who'd survived 3 decades in military aviation. "You know there's more to this than proving a point to Tucker and his crowd. If you're wrong about the aircraft's condition, if something goes wrong during the flight, you could end up grounded permanently. Or worse, I know the risks. But I also know this aircraft better than anyone else on this base. If it's going to fly for anyone, it should be someone who understands every bolt and wire that holds it together." They worked together in comfortable silence, Hernandez providing an extra set of experienced hands while Troy conducted his detailed inspection. The sergeant's presence was reassuring, a reminder that Troy wasn't completely alone in his belief that the old F-16 had been prematurely condemned. As the evening progressed, Troy's initial assessment proved accurate. The aircraft's systems showed wear, but remained fundamentally sound. The engines had been properly maintained. The flight controls responded smoothly to manual testing, and the avionics, while outdated, functioned within acceptable parameters. More importantly, Troy began to recognize modifications that Rebecca had documented in her personal notes, but hadn't transferred to the official maintenance records. Small improvements to the hydraulic system, minor adjustments to the fuel mixture controls, and subtle changes to the flight control software that enhanced the aircraft's responsiveness in ways that wouldn't be apparent to casual observers. "She really did love this machine," Troy murmured, discovering another of Rebecca's undocumented improvements buried in the electrical system's secondary circuits. "She saw potential where others saw problems," Hernandez agreed. "Kind of like what you're doing now." By midnight, Troy had compiled a comprehensive assessment that painted a different picture than the official reports. The aircraft was airworthy, requiring only minor repairs to bring it up to full operational standards. The parts needed were already available in base inventory, and the work could be completed within a week if properly prioritized. The real question wasn't whether 1275 could fly, it was whether the Air Force would allow a maintenance chief to prove that everyone else had been wrong about its capabilities. As they secured the hangar for the night, Hernandez offered a final piece of advice. Whatever you decide to do, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Rebecca would want you to fly again, but she'd also want you to come home to Lily every night. Walking across the dark base toward his quarters, Troy carried the weight of possibility and responsibility in equal measure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight he allowed himself to imagine the sensation of lifting off in Rebecca's favorite aircraft, finally fulfilling the promise he'd made to the woman who'd believed in dreams that others couldn't see. 3 days had passed since Troy's public challenge, and the base buzzed with speculation about whether he would actually follow through with his request. Some airmen wagered on how quickly Brennan would shut down the idea, while others wondered if the quiet maintenance chief might actually have the skills to back up his bold words. Troy spent those days methodically preparing, treating each task with the same careful attention he'd always applied to aircraft maintenance. But today was different. Today, he would search through Rebecca's personal effects, hoping to find insights that might guide his preparation for the flight that seemed increasingly inevitable. The storage unit off base held the remnants of their shared life, carefully preserved items that Troy hadn't been ready to sort through during the immediate aftermath of her death. Boxes labeled in Rebecca's precise handwriting contained flight suits, technical manuals, photographs, and personal mementos from a career that had been cut tragically short. Near the bottom of the third box, Troy discovered something that made his hands tremble. Rebecca's personal flight logbook lay wrapped in a silk scarf she'd worn during their honeymoon, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, her careful entries documented every flight from her initial solo through her final mission, complete with notes about aircraft performance, weather conditions, and lessons learned. But it was the entry dated just 2 months before her diagnosis that stopped Troy cold. She'd flown 1275 on what would be her last test flight, conducting an evaluation of modifications she'd been developing in secret. Her notes revealed a level of innovation that went far beyond routine maintenance. Procedures. Hydraulic response time improved by 0.3 seconds with pressure valve adjustment, she'd written in her familiar script. Engine restart capability enhanced through fuel system modifications. Aircraft demonstrates exceptional stability characteristics. In high-G maneuvers when configured per attached specifications. The specifications she referenced were tucked between the logbook's pages. Detailed technical drawings and modification procedures that transformed 1275 from a standard F-16 into something approaching a custom-built racing machine. Rebecca had been preparing for a demonstration flight that would showcase the aircraft's hidden potential. But her illness had intervened before she could complete the project. Reading further, Troy discovered the emotional context behind her technical work. She'd been fighting discrimination from colleagues who questioned her expertise, and she'd intended to use 1275's improved performance as proof that innovation could come from unexpected sources. The parallels to his current situation were impossible to ignore. "If anything happens to me," read a note paperclipped to the logbook's final entry, "I hope Troy will finish what we started. He understands these aircraft better than anyone realizes, and he has the courage to prove what they're really capable of achieving." Troy closed the logbook with reverent care, feeling the weight of Rebecca's expectations and his own unfulfilled potential. She'd seen something in him that he'd spent years trying to forget, and her hidden work provided a roadmap for demonstrating capabilities that others had overlooked. Returning to base, He found Hernandez waiting in the hangar with news that would change everything. "Brennan wants to see you in his office," Hernandez said, his expression carefully neutral. "He's got Colonel Davidson with him from Wing headquarters." The walk to the administrative building felt longer than usual, each step carrying Troy closer to a conversation that would determine whether his request would receive serious consideration or be dismissed as the fantasy of an overreaching maintenance. Chief Brennan's office reflected the organized efficiency of a career officer who'd learned to balance operational demands with administrative requirements. Colonel Davidson, a silver-haired veteran with the bearing of someone who'd seen combat in multiple theaters, occupied the chair typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. "Matheson," Brennan began, his tone more formal than usual, "Colonel Davidson has some questions about your request to conduct a test flight." Davidson studied Troy with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating personnel under pressure. "Master Sergeant, I've reviewed your service record. Exemplary maintenance performance, outstanding ratings from supervisors, and a safety record that any crew chief would envy. But your flying credentials lapsed over a decade ago." "Yes, sir. Family circumstances required me to focus on ground duties." "I see." Davidson consulted a folder that contained more information than Troy had expected. "I also see that you were married to Captain Rebecca Matheson, one of the finest test pilots this wing ever produced. Her final reports included some interesting observations about aircraft 84-1275. Troy felt his pulse quicken, uncertain how much the colonel knew about Rebecca's secret modifications. "Sir, my wife believed that aircraft had untapped potential. She'd been working on improvements that might have enhanced its operational capabilities." Davidson nodded slowly. According to her unofficial notes, those improvements were quite extensive. "The question is whether you understand them well enough to demonstrate their effectiveness." The conversation was heading in a direction Troy hadn't anticipated. Instead of dismissing his request, the senior officers seemed genuinely interested in what he might be able to accomplish. "I believe I do, sir. My wife and I discussed her work extensively, and I've continued studying her modifications over the years." Brennan leaned forward, his expression intense. "Matheson, I'm going to be direct with you. This base has been under pressure to justify keeping older aircraft in our inventory. If you can prove that 1275 has capabilities we've overlooked, it might influence decisions being made at much higher levels." Davidson added his own perspective. "The Air Force is always interested in innovative approaches to aircraft utilization. If your wife's modifications are as promising as her notes suggest, a successful demonstration could have implications beyond this single aircraft." Troy realized he was being offered an opportunity that extended far beyond personal vindication. The test flight could become a proof of concept for Rebecca's innovations, potentially influencing how the military approached aircraft modification and life extension programs. "What would you need from me, sir?" "Complete documentation of all modifications, a detailed flight plan that demonstrates improved capabilities, and assurance that you can execute the demonstration safely," Davidson replied. "If you can provide those elements, I'm prepared to authorize a formal evaluation flight." The meeting concluded with specific requirements and timelines that made Troy's challenge feel suddenly real and achievable. Walking back to the hangar, he carried the weight of possibility and the ghost of Rebecca's encouragement. Hernandez was waiting with Lily, who'd been released early from school and was eager to hear about her father's meeting with the base commanders. "Well?" she asked, her eyes bright with hope. Troy knelt down to meet her gaze, seeing Rebecca's determination reflected in their daughter's expression. "It looks like we're going to find out what that old airplane can really do." For the first time in years, the future felt full of potential rather than resignation. The work began before dawn, with Troy methodically implementing Rebecca's modifications under Hernandez's watchful supervision. Each adjustment required precision and patience, transforming theoretical improvements into tangible changes that would either validate Rebecca's innovations or expose fatal flaws in her design concepts. As Troy worked deeper into the aircraft systems, he discovered something that stopped him cold. Hidden behind an access panel that he'd opened countless times over the years was a small recording device, carefully secured and connected to the aircraft's communication system. His hands shook as he realized what Rebecca had hidden there, a backup of her emergency procedures manual, recorded in her own voice. He connected his headset and pressed play, feeling time collapse as Rebecca's familiar voice filled his consciousness. "If you're hearing this, Troy, it means you finally decided to stop hiding from what we both know you're capable of achieving," her recorded voice began, carrying the warmth and certainty that had sustained him through their darkest moments. "This aircraft isn't just a machine. It's a testament to what's possible when someone refuses to accept other people's limitations." The recording continued with detailed technical guidance, but it was the personal message that followed that brought tears to his eyes. "I know you're scared. I know you think you're protecting Lily by playing it safe. But our daughter needs to see that dreams are worth fighting for, that setbacks don't define capabilities, and that sometimes the most important flights are the ones that other people say are impossible." Troy listened to the entire recording 3 times, absorbing both the technical details and the emotional encouragement that Rebecca had left for him. She'd known this day would come, had prepared for the moment when he would finally be ready to reclaim the dreams they'd shared. The modifications themselves were masterpieces of engineering ingenuity. Rebecca had found ways to enhance the aircraft's performance without compromising its fundamental safety characteristics. The hydraulic improvements reduced response lag. The fuel system changes enhanced engine efficiency, and the flight control modifications provided better handling characteristics in extreme conditions. But implementing the changes required skills that went beyond routine maintenance. Troy found himself drawing on knowledge he'd accumulated over 2 decades, combining Rebecca's innovations with his own understanding of aircraft systems to create something that transcended the sum of its parts. Major Brennan appeared in the hangar during the 2nd day of modifications, his expression mixing curiosity with growing concern about what he'd authorized. "How's the work progressing, Matheson?" Troy emerged from the aircraft's belly, his uniform stained with hydraulic fluid and his hands bearing the small cuts that were inevitable when working with precision components. "The modifications are more extensive than I initially realized, sir. My wife essentially redesigned several critical systems to optimize performance characteristics." "Are you saying the aircraft will perform differently than standard F-16 specifications?" "Yes, sir. If Rebecca's calculations are correct, it should demonstrate superior maneuverability, faster acceleration, and more responsive handling across all flight regimes." Brennan studied the organized chaos of parts and tools surrounding the aircraft. "And if her calculations are wrong?" Troy met his commanding officer's gaze directly. "Then I'll discover that during the test flight, and we'll have learned something valuable about the limits of aircraft modification." The Major's expression suggested he was beginning to question the wisdom of approving such an unconventional experiment. "Matheson, I want to be clear about something. This evaluation flight has attracted attention from people well above my pay grade. Colonel Davidson has briefed Wing Headquarters, and there are senior officers who are very interested in the results." "I understand, sir. I hope you do. Because if this goes badly, it won't just affect your career. It could influence how the Air Force approaches aircraft life extension programs for years to come." After Brennan departed, Hernandez helped Troy install the final components of Rebecca's modification package. The changes were subtle but significant, improvements that would be invisible to casual observers, but would fundamentally alter the aircraft's performance characteristics. She really thought this through, Hernandez observed as they calibrated the modified fuel injection system. "These aren't amateur modifications. This is professional-level engineering." "Rebecca never did anything halfway," Troy replied, adjusting a pressure sensor to match the specifications from her hidden notes. When she decided to prove that 1275 had untapped potential, she approached it like a doctoral dissertation. That evening, as they secured the hangar, Troy felt the weight of approaching responsibility. Tomorrow would bring the formal flight evaluation, when months of preparation would be tested against the unforgiving reality of actual flight conditions. Lily appeared as they were completing their final checks, her small form silhouetted against the hangar's bright lights. She'd been staying with the Hernandez family during the intensive modification period, but she'd insisted on being present for this milestone. "Is it ready, Dad?" Troy knelt down to meet her eyes, seeing Rebecca's faith reflected in their daughter's expression. "The aircraft is ready. The question is whether I am." "Mom knew you were ready," Lily said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "She told me so before she died." The statement hit Troy like a physical blow. Lily had never mentioned such a conversation, and he'd assumed she was too young to remember specific discussions from Rebecca's final days. She said that sometimes people forget how strong they are when they're scared of getting hurt again. But she said you were the bravest person she knew, and that someday you'd remember how to fly. Troy pulled his daughter into a hug that contained 8 years of suppressed grief and newfound determination. Rebecca's wisdom, preserved in their daughter's memory, provided the final piece of courage he needed to face tomorrow's challenge. "Your mother was right about a lot of things," he whispered into Lily's hair, "and she was definitely right about you being the smartest kid on this base." As the Nevada stars emerged overhead, Troy felt the convergence of past promises and future possibilities. The aircraft was ready, Rebecca's voice provided guidance from beyond, and their daughter's faith offered strength for whatever challenges lay ahead. The test flight would determine more than just the aircraft's capabilities. It would define whether dreams deferred could still be dreams fulfilled, and whether a father's love could honor both the past and secure the future. Standing beside the modified F-16, with Lily's hand in his and Rebecca's spirit surrounding them both, Troy finally understood that some flights were worth taking regardless of the destination. Tomorrow, he would discover whether courage could overcome caution, and whether an old aircraft and an older dream could prove that potential never truly dies. It simply waits for the right moment to soar. The discovery came at 3 in the morning, while Troy was conducting his final pre-flight systems check. Hidden beneath Rebecca's pilot seat, secured in a compartment he'd never noticed despite years of maintaining the aircraft, was a sealed envelope bearing his name in her familiar handwriting. Inside, he found something that changed everything he thought he knew about his wife's final months. A congressional medal citation awarded posthumously for extraordinary heroism during a classified test flight mission. The official language was sterile, describing exceptional valor in the face of extreme danger and selfless sacrifice that saved the lives of fellow aircrew members, but the personal letter attached told the real story. Rebecca hadn't died from a simple training accident, as he'd been told. She'd been conducting a high-risk evaluation of emergency procedures when a catastrophic system failure turned her aircraft into a flying bomb. Instead of ejecting to save herself, she'd stayed with the aircraft long enough to steer it away from a populated area, ensuring that her death wouldn't become a tragedy for dozens of innocent families. The letter, written by her squadron commander during her final hospitalization, revealed that Rebecca had volunteered for the dangerous mission, specifically because she trusted her own modifications to 1275 systems. She'd believed so strongly in her innovations that she'd risked everything to prove their effectiveness under the most extreme conditions possible. She knew the risks, the commander had written, but she also knew that her work could save lives if properly validated. "She asked me to ensure that you understood her choice wasn't reckless. It was calculated courage, based on absolute faith in her abilities and her aircraft." Troy sat in the hangar's silence, processing the revelation that his wife had been a hero in ways he'd never imagined. Her death hadn't been a random tragedy. It had been the deliberate sacrifice of someone who understood that some principles were worth dying for. But the letter contained one more surprise. Rebecca had requested that 1275 be preserved specifically for Troy, believing that he would eventually be ready to complete the work she'd started. The aircraft's apparent deterioration had been carefully orchestrated, a way of protecting it from premature retirement until he was prepared to demonstrate its true capabilities. The old bird was never broken, he murmured to himself, understanding finally why certain maintenance requests had been mysteriously delayed, why parts orders had been lost in bureaucratic confusion, why the aircraft had remained available despite repeated recommendations for decommissioning. Hernandez appeared in the hangar entrance, moving with the careful stealth of someone who'd learned to read situations quickly. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, settling into a nearby chair with practiced ease. Troy held up the medal citation, his hand still trembling from the emotional impact of his discovery. "Did you know?" Hernandez studied the document, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition to something approaching relief. "I wondered when you'd find that. Rebecca made me promise not to tell you unless you started asking the right questions. You've known all along that she was a hero. I've known that she died saving lives, and that she believed you were the only person capable of finishing what she started." Hernandez leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets. "She also knew that you needed time to heal before you could handle the responsibility of carrying her legacy forward." Troy felt anger building alongside his grief, anger at being protected from the truth, anger at years of diminished expectations, anger at his own willingness to accept limitations that others had imposed. "Why didn't anyone tell me? Why did you let me think she died in a routine training accident?" "Because she asked us to. Rebecca knew that if you learned the truth too soon, you'd try to prove yourself before you were ready. She wanted you to choose courage because you'd rediscovered your own strength, not because you felt obligated to live up to her sacrifice." The conversation was interrupted by footsteps approaching across the hangar floor. Major Brennan appeared, accompanied by Colonel Davidson and a woman Troy didn't recognize, someone whose bearing suggested senior leadership despite her civilian clothes. "Matheson," Davidson said, his voice carrying unusual formality. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Patricia Vaughn from the Pentagon's Advanced Aircraft Systems Office. She's here to observe tomorrow's evaluation flight." Dr. Vaughn extended her hand with the confident grip of someone accustomed to dealing with military personnel. "Master Sergeant, I've been following your wife's work for several years. Her modifications to aircraft 1275 represent some of the most innovative thinking we've seen in the area of legacy aircraft optimization." Troy struggled to process the implications of having Pentagon oversight for what he'd thought would be a simple base-level demonstration. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand the level of interest in this flight. Your wife's final report suggested that her modification package could extend the operational life of older aircraft by decades while improving their performance beyond original specifications," Dr. Vaughn explained. "If you can demonstrate those capabilities tomorrow, it could influence aircraft procurement decisions worth billions of dollars." Brennan stepped forward, his expression mixing pride with concern. "Matheson, what started as a request to test an old aircraft has become something much larger. There are people in Washington who see this as a potential solution to some very expensive problems." The weight of expectation felt crushing. Troy had imagined proving himself to a handful of base personnel, not demonstrating innovations that could influence national defense policy. "Sir, I'm just a maintenance chief who wants to honor his wife's memory. I'm not qualified to represent the future of military aviation." Dr. Vaughn smiled with the patience of someone who'd heard similar concerns before. "Master Sergeant, the most important innovations often come from people who understand problems at the practical level rather than the theoretical level. Your wife believed you had insights that academic researchers might miss." As the officials departed, leaving Troy alone with his thoughts and his overwhelming new responsibilities, he realized that tomorrow's flight would determine more than just his personal redemption. It would validate or discredit Rebecca's life work, influence military spending decisions, and potentially change how the Air Force approached aircraft modernization. Standing beside 1275, he felt Rebecca's presence more strongly than ever. She'd orchestrated events from beyond the grave, ensuring that her innovations would receive proper evaluation while protecting him from pressure he hadn't been ready to handle. "You always did. Think 3 moves ahead," he whispered, to the aircraft that had become a monument to her genius and a sacrifice. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test of whether love, engineering brilliance, and carefully delayed courage could combine to create something extraordinary from something that everyone else had written off as obsolete. Dawn broke with an urgency that Troy hadn't expected. Instead of the calm preparation he'd planned for his evaluation flight, he was awakened by pounding on his quarters door and the unmistakable sound of helicopters landing on the base's emergency pad. Hernandez stood outside, his face grim with news that would transform everything they'd prepared for. "Troy, we've got a situation. Search and rescue just lost contact with a team trapped in the mountains near the Nevada-California border. Avalanche conditions have grounded all conventional rescue aircraft, and time is running out." Troy pulled on his flight suit, his mind struggling to process how a routine test flight had suddenly become an emergency rescue mission. "What does this have to do with 1275? The trapped team is in a location that requires precise, high-altitude maneuvering to reach safely. Standard rescue helicopters can't operate in those conditions. And our newer fighters don't have the range for a sustained operation at that altitude." They walked quickly toward the hangar, where Troy could see unusual activity around multiple aircraft. Ground crews were preparing equipment he didn't recognize, while personnel from other squadrons gathered around briefing tables that hadn't been there the night before. Colonel Davidson met them at the hangar entrance, his expression mixing urgency with something approaching desperation. "Matheson, I'm going to be direct with you. We've got 6 people trapped at 11,000 feet in conditions that are beyond the capabilities of our standard rescue assets. According to Dr. Vaughn's analysis, your wife's modifications to 1275 might give it the performance characteristics needed to reach them." Troy felt his stomach drop as the implications became clear. "Sir, this was supposed to be a controlled evaluation flight. I'm not qualified to conduct actual rescue operations. Under normal circumstances, I'd agree with you. But we don't have normal circumstances, and we don't have time to find conventional solutions." Dr. Vaughn appeared beside them, carrying technical specifications and weather reports that painted a grim picture of the challenges ahead. "Master Sergeant, the trapped personnel include 2 Air Force officers and 4 civilian researchers who were conducting classified work in that region. Their emergency beacon is weakening, which suggests they're running out of power and probably heat." She spread out topographical maps that showed the rescue site in devastating detail. The location was accessible only through a narrow valley surrounded by peaks that exceeded the operational ceiling of most rescue aircraft. Worse weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly, creating a window of opportunity that was closing by the hour. "Your wife's modifications included improvements to high-altitude performance and emergency power systems," Dr. Vaughn continued. "According to her calculations, 12 and 75 should be able to operate effectively in conditions that would ground other aircraft." Troy studied the maps, his maintenance training allowing him to visualize the technical challenges involved. The rescue would require sustained flight at extreme altitude, precise maneuvering in confined spaces, and the ability to hover while personnel were extracted using specialized equipment. "Ma'am, those are theoretical capabilities based on computer modeling. We don't know if Rebecca's modifications will actually perform as designed under real-world stress." Colonel Davidson stepped closer, his voice carrying the weight of command responsibility. "Matheson, I'm not ordering you to attempt this rescue, but I'm telling you that 6 people are going to die if we can't reach them in the next 4 hours. And you're flying the only Aircraft that might be capable of getting there. The hangar fell. Silent as everyone present understood the magnitude of the decision facing Troy. What had begun as a personal quest to honor his wife's memory had become a life-or-death test of her innovations. Under the most demanding conditions possible, Hernandez placed a hand on Troy's shoulder, offering support without pressure. Whatever you decide, we'll make it work. But you need to know that Rebecca designed these modifications specifically for situations that other aircraft couldn't handle. Troy thought about the recording he'd discovered. Rebecca's voice encouraging him to trust in capabilities that others couldn't see. She'd spent her final months preparing for exactly this kind of moment, when theoretical improvements would be tested against real-world emergencies. What kind of support would I have? Dr. Vaughn consulted her notes before responding. Full communication backup, weather monitoring from multiple sources, and a chase aircraft to provide navigation assistance. Plus, we'd install emergency extraction equipment that's specifically designed for high-altitude rescue operations. Major Brennan added his perspective with characteristic directness. Matheson, I've never asked anyone to risk their life for a test flight, but this isn't a test flight anymore. It's a rescue mission that happens to be using experimental aircraft modifications. Troy looked around the hangar at the faces watching him, seeing a mixture of hope, concern, and professional respect that he'd never experienced before. These weren't people pressuring him to prove a point. They were colleagues asking him to save lives, using capabilities that only he fully understood. How long do I have to decide? Aircraft preparation will take 2 hours, Davidson replied. Weather conditions start deteriorating at noon. If you're going to attempt this, we need to launch no later than 10:30. Troy walked to 1275 and placed his hand on its wing, feeling the solid reality of metal and engineering that represented years of Rebecca's innovative thinking. The aircraft had been designed for exactly this moment, not for glory or vindication, but for the practical purpose of saving lives when conventional solutions weren't sufficient. Lily, he said suddenly, realizing he hadn't considered how to explain this development to his daughter. She's with my family, Hernandez assured him, and she already knows what you're going to decide. How? Because she knows what her mother would have done, and she knows you're the same kind of person. Standing beside the aircraft that had become a symbol of dreams, deferred and potential realized. Troy felt the convergence of past promises and present responsibilities. Rebecca had prepared him for this moment through years of shared knowledge and hidden recordings, trusting that when the time came, he would have the courage to risk everything for people he'd never met. Let's prep the aircraft, he said quietly, his voice carrying the steady determination of someone who'd finally found his purpose. We've got people to bring home. The hangar erupted into controlled activity as specialized teams began modifying TIE for its most important mission, proving that sometimes the most crucial flights are the ones that no one sees coming, and that innovation born from love can bridge the gap between impossible and inevitable. The transformation of 1275 from test aircraft to rescue platform took place with military precision, but Troy could feel the weight of approaching deadline in every hurried conversation and rushed equipment installation. Specialized rescue gear appeared from storage areas he didn't know existed, while technicians integrated communication systems that would allow him to coordinate with ground teams and the trapped personnel. Dr. Vaughn supervised the technical modifications with the intensity of someone who understood that theoretical calculations were about to face their ultimate test. The rescue harness system adds approximately 400 pounds to your aircraft weight, she explained, as crews secured the equipment to 1275's external hardpoints. Your wife's fuel efficiency improvements should compensate for the additional load, but it will affect your performance margins, Troy nodded, running mental calculations based on Rebecca's documented modifications. The aircraft would be operating at the edge of its capabilities, requiring perfect execution of procedures that had never been tested under actual emergency conditions. Hernandez appeared with Troy's flight gear, including a helmet equipped with the latest communication technology and a survival suit designed for high-altitude operations. "Lily wanted me to give you this," he said, handing Troy a small bracelet made of colorful beads and metal charms. Troy recognized it immediately as Rebecca's lucky charm bracelet, the one she'd worn during every important flight of her career. Each charm represented a successful mission, and Lily had apparently been saving it for exactly this moment. "She said Mom would want you to have all her luck today," Hernandez explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She also said to tell you that she's not worried because you're the best pilot on the base. Even if some people forgot." The bracelet felt warm in Troy's hands, as if it retained some essence of Rebecca's confidence and skill. He secured it around his wrist, drawing strength from the tangible connection to the woman who'd prepared him for this moment without his knowledge. Colonel Davidson approached with final weather reports that painted an increasingly challenging picture. Conditions at the rescue site are deteriorating faster than predicted. Wind speeds are approaching the maximum safe limits for helicopter operations, and visibility is dropping due to blowing snow. What about the trapped personnel? Last communication was 30 minutes ago. They're running low on battery power and heating fuel. Our estimate is that they have maybe 3 hours before hypothermia becomes a serious threat. Troy studied the meteorological data, recognizing patterns that Rebecca had taught him to identify during their years of shared flying. The weather system was complex but predictable, creating opportunities for someone who understood how to work with natural forces rather than fighting against them. "Sir, I think we can use the wind patterns to our advantage. If we approach from the eastern valley and time our arrival properly, the mountain effect should give us additional lift when we need it most." Dr. Vaughn looked up from her calculations with surprise. "That's exactly what your wife recommended in her high-altitude flight procedures manual." "How did you know?" "She used to say that weather was just another system to understand and work with. She taught me to read conditions the way she read aircraft performance data. The final hour before launch felt simultaneously endless and instantaneous." Troy completed his pre-flight inspection with methodical thoroughness, checking every system twice and confirming that Rebecca's modifications were functioning within normal parameters. The aircraft responded to his touch with an eagerness that seemed almost alive, as if it understood the importance of the mission ahead. Captain Tucker appeared unexpectedly, his usual arrogance replaced by something approaching respect. "Matheson, I wanted to apologize for what I said the other day. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about this aircraft." Troy accepted the apology with a nod, understanding that crisis had a way of clarifying what really mattered. "Captain, I'd appreciate it if you could keep an eye on Lily while I'm gone. She's going to be worried no matter what anyone tells her. Consider it done. And Matheson, bring those people home. Show everyone what you and that old bird are really capable of." As the launch time approached, Troy found himself thinking not about the technical challenges ahead, but about the human cost of failure. 6 people were depending on his ability to execute a rescue that pushed both him and his aircraft beyond proven limits. The weight of that responsibility was balanced by the strength he drew from Rebecca's presence and the knowledge that he was finally fulfilling the promise he'd made to her during their last conversation. The radio crackled with final coordination messages as Troy settled into 1275's cockpit. The seat seemed to embrace him with familiar comfort, while the controls felt perfectly positioned for his hands. Rebecca's voice recording played in his headset, providing technical guidance mixed with personal encouragement that made him feel less alone in the approaching challenge. "Tower, this is Rescue 1, requesting final clearance for emergency mission launch," Troy transmitted, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Rescue 1, you are cleared for immediate departure. Weather window is optimal for the next 45 minutes. Good luck, and bring them home." Troy advanced the throttles, feeling 1275's modified engines respond with smooth power that exceeded the original specifications. Rebecca's improvements were working exactly as designed. providing the performance margin that would be essential for high-altitude operations in challenging conditions. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, Troy felt the familiar sensation of leaving Earth behind. But this time it carried additional meaning. He wasn't just flying, he was carrying forward Rebecca's legacy, proving that innovation born from love could overcome obstacles that defeated conventional approaches. The Nevada landscape fell away below as 1275 climbed toward its operational ceiling, every system functioning flawlessly despite the additional weight of rescue equipment. Troy could feel Rebecca's presence in the aircraft's responsive handling, her voice guiding him through procedures she'd developed specifically for missions that others considered impossible. Rescue 1. You have 6 souls depending on your success, came the radio transmission from base operations. Weather conditions at target remain marginal but stable. Estimated flight time to rescue site is 37 minutes. Troy acknowledged the transmission while performing final systems checks, confirming that everything was ready for the most important flight of his life. In the distance, mountain peaks rose like granite monuments to the challenges ahead. But he felt ready to meet them with an aircraft that embodied the best of human innovation and the power of love transcending loss. The rescue site awaited, and with it, the ultimate test of whether dreams deferred could become dreams fulfilled when the stakes were measured in human lives rather than personal vindication. The mountain peaks emerged from the morning haze like ancient guardians protecting secrets that humans weren't meant to discover. Troy felt 1275 respond to the changing air density as they climbed above 10,000 feet, Rebecca's modifications providing the additional power and efficiency that made sustained high-altitude flight possible. Rescue 1. This is base operations. We're showing you at 11,200 feet and climbing. Target elevation is 11,600. How are your aircraft systems responding? Troy scanned his instruments, seeing performance readings that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Base operations, all systems nominal. Engine temperature is stable, fuel consumption is below calculated estimates, and aircraft handling is exceptional. The radio crackled with Dr. Vaughan's voice, monitoring from the base communication center. Master Sergeant, your wife's modifications are performing exactly as her models predicted. You're operating in flight regimes that would challenge much newer aircraft. Through his headset, Troy could hear Rebecca's recorded voice providing guidance for high-altitude operations, her calm instructions mixing with real-time communications from base operations. It felt like flying with the best instructor he'd ever known, someone who understood both the technical and emotional challenges of pushing aircraft beyond their supposed limitations. The first indication of weather trouble appeared as a wall of gray clouds that seemed to stretch from the valley floor to the upper atmosphere. Wind readings on his instruments showed gusts approaching 30 knots, strong enough to make precision flying extremely difficult. Rescue 1, we're showing deteriorating conditions at your target. Visibility is dropping and wind speeds are increasing. Do you want to abort and wait for improved weather? Troy considered the option for exactly 3 seconds before rejecting it. The trapped personnel didn't have time for weather to improve, and 1275's modified flight control systems were designed specifically for challenging conditions. Negative base operations. Aircraft is handling well, and we still have adequate visibility for approach. Continuing to target. He could hear doubt in the radio operator's voice, but also recognition that this was Troy's decision to make. The rescue team on the ground was depending on his judgment about what was possible and what was too dangerous to attempt. The valley opened below him like a snow-covered amphitheater, with sheer rock walls rising on both sides and a narrow floor that contained the emergency beacon signal from the trapped team. Troy could see the crash site clearly, a small aircraft that had apparently suffered mechanical failure while conducting survey work in the remote area. Base operations, I have visual contact with the target. I can see the downed aircraft and what appears to be a temporary shelter constructed from aircraft parts and emergency supplies. Rescue 1, can you establish communication with the survivors? Troy switched to the emergency frequency and transmitted directly to the crash site. Survivor team, this is Air Force Rescue 1. Do you copy? The response came immediately, filled with relief and desperation. Rescue 1, this is Dr. Jennifer Walsh, team leader. We have 6 personnel, 2 with moderate injuries and 1 with possible hypothermia. We've been here for 18 hours and our heating fuel is almost exhausted. Dr. Walsh, I'm going to conduct a reconnaissance pass to evaluate landing options. Stay in your shelter and be ready for extraction when I give the signal. Troy banked 1275 into a tight spiral, using Rebecca's modified flight controls to maintain precise control despite the increasing wind conditions. The aircraft handled like a much smaller plane, responding to his inputs with an immediacy that made complex maneuvering possible in the confined space. The landing area was worse than he'd hoped, but better than he'd feared. A relatively flat section of snow-covered ground offered enough space for a careful touchdown, but the approach would require threading 1275 between rock formations with minimal clearance on both sides. Base operations. I'm going to attempt a landing at the rescue site. Terrain is challenging but manageable. Aircraft performance is exceeding expectations. Rescue 1, be advised that weather conditions are continuing to deteriorate. You may have only one opportunity for safe extraction. Troy acknowledged the warning while beginning his approach, using techniques that Rebecca had developed for precision flying in confined spaces. The modified engines provided smooth power response, while the enhanced flight controls allowed him to make minute adjustments that kept 1275 precisely on the narrow approach path. The wind hit them as they descended into the valley. Powerful gusts that tried to push the aircraft off course. But Rebecca's modifications included improved stability systems that helped counter the turbulence, and Troy found himself able to maintain control despite conditions that would have defeated a standard F-16. 50 feet and descending, he transmitted. More for his own reference than for base operations. Terrain clearance is adequate, wind conditions are manageable. Through the canopy, he could see the survivors emerging from their shelter. 6 figures in bright orange survival suits who represented the success or failure of everything Rebecca had worked to achieve. Their faces turned upward toward 1275 with expressions of hope mixed with disbelief that rescue had actually arrived. The landing was harder than Troy preferred, but well within acceptable limits. 1275 touched down on the snow-packed surface and slid slightly before coming to a controlled stop less than 50 yards from the crash site. The engines spooled down to idle power while Troy prepared for the most critical phase of the mission. Base operations. Rescue 1 is on the ground at target location. Beginning survivor extraction immediately. Outstanding work, Rescue 1. Be advised that weather window is closing rapidly. Recommend maximum speed for extraction operations. Troy secured the aircraft and opened the canopy, immediately feeling the bite of high-altitude cold and thin air. But the rescue equipment functioned flawlessly, and within minutes he was coordinating with Dr. Walsh to transfer her injured team members into 1275's modified passenger compartment, the aircraft that had been designed for a single pilot now. Carried 7 people, pushing its weight limits to the edge of what Rebecca's modifications could handle. But as Troy prepared for takeoff, he could feel the aircraft's eagerness to prove itself under the most demanding conditions possible. Everyone secure back there? He called to his passengers. We're ready, Dr. Walsh replied, her voice carrying gratitude that words couldn't adequately express. And thank you for risking everything to get us out of here. Troy advanced the throttles, feeling 1275 strain against the additional weight, but respond with the enhanced power that Rebecca's engine modifications provided. The takeoff roll was longer than normal, but the aircraft lifted off cleanly and began climbing toward the safety of lower altitude and clearer weather. Behind them, the mountain valley disappeared into the grey clouds that had made rescue seem impossible just hours earlier. Ahead lay the return flight to base and the completion of a mission that had transformed from personal vindication into life-saving reality. The return flight began smoothly, with 1275 climbing steadily, despite carrying nearly double its normal passenger load. Troy could feel the aircraft working harder than usual, but Rebecca's modifications were proving their worth under the most demanding conditions possible. The enhanced fuel efficiency meant they had adequate range for the return journey, while the improved engine performance provided the power needed to maintain safe flight with the additional weight. Base operations. Rescue 1 departing target area with 6 survivors on board. All personnel are stable, and aircraft is performing within acceptable parameters. Rescue 1, outstanding work. Weather conditions at base remain clear, and medical teams are standing by for survivor care. Estimated flight time for return is 42 minutes. Troy settled into the rhythm of long-distance flight, monitoring his instruments while maintaining communication with both base operations and his passengers. Dr. Walsh provided updates on the condition of her injured team members, while Troy focused on flying the most precise course possible to minimize their time in the deteriorating weather. It was during the 20th minute of their return flight that everything changed. The radio call came from an unexpected source, a search and rescue helicopter operating in a different sector of the mountain range. Any aircraft, this is Air Force Rescue 27. We have an emergency situation and require immediate assistance. Troy responded immediately, his training taking over despite the complexity of his current mission. Rescue 27, this is Rescue 1. What is the nature of your emergency? Rescue 1, we have engine failure at 8,000 feet and are conducting emergency auto-rotation to a forced landing. We have 4 crew members on board and limited survival equipment. Our location is approximately 20 miles northwest of your last known position. Troy felt his stomach drop as he realized the implications. Another rescue crew was going down in the same mountainous terrain that had already claimed 1 aircraft, and 1275 was the only rescue asset currently airborne with the capability to reach them. Base operations, are you monitoring this situation? Colonel Davidson's voice came through clearly, carrying the weight of command decisions that had no good options. Rescue 1, we copy the emergency transmission. Be advised that diverting to assist Rescue 27 would require flying through deteriorating weather conditions with minimal fuel. Reserves. Troy ran quick calculations based on 1275's current fuel state and the additional distance required to reach the downed helicopter. The numbers were tight, very tight, but Rebecca's fuel efficiency improvements provided just enough margin to make the rescue attempt possible. Base operations. I can reach Rescue 27's location, but it will require using all available fuel reserves. Request permission to attempt secondary rescue. Operation. The radio silence stretched. For long seconds while base operations consulted with higher authorities about authorizing a mission that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. Dr. Walsh's voice came from the passenger compartment, clear and determined. Pilot, my team and I volunteer to support any rescue attempt. Those helicopter crew members would do the same for us. Her statement was followed by murmurs of agreement from the other survivors. People who understood that rescue personnel took exceptional risks to save others and deserved the same consideration in return. Rescue 1. You are authorized to attempt secondary rescue operation. Be advised that this decision pushes you beyond all safety margins. If you cannot reach Rescue 27 successfully, return immediately to base. Troy banked 1275 toward the new heading, feeling the aircraft respond with the same willing spirit that had carried them through the first rescue. Rebecca's voice continued to provide guidance through his headset. Her recorded instructions covering emergency procedures and fuel management techniques that would be essential for completing such an ambitious mission. The helicopter's crash site was visible from several miles away, a dark smear against the white snow where Rescue 27 had executed. A hard but survivable landing in a clearing, barely large enough to contain the aircraft. Troy could see figures moving around the wreckage, indicating that the crew had survived the impact and was working to establish emergency shelter. Rescue 27. This is Rescue 1. I have you in sight and am beginning approach for personnel recovery. Rescue 1. This is Major Christine Foster, Aircraft Commander of Rescue 27. We have 4 personnel, all ambulatory, but with minor injuries from the crash landing. Are you sure you can handle additional passengers? Troy looked back at his current passengers, who were already rearranging themselves to make room for 4 more people in a space designed for 1. We'll make it work, Major. Stand by for touchdown. The second landing was even more challenging than the first, requiring Troy to set 1275 down on a slope with crosswinds that tested every modification Rebecca had made to the aircraft's stability systems. But the landing was successful, and within minutes the helicopter crew was aboard, bringing 1275's total passenger load to 10 people in an aircraft designed for solo operations. The takeoff was the most demanding flight operation Troy had ever attempted. 1275 struggled against the additional weight, using every available foot of the improvised runway to achieve flying speed. But Rebecca's engine modifications provided just enough extra power, and the aircraft lifted off with minimal altitude to spare above the surrounding trees. Base operations. Rescue 1 airborne with 10 souls on board. Fuel state is critical, but all personnel are secure, and aircraft is maintaining controlled flight. Rescue 1. You are cleared for direct routing to base. Emergency services and fuel trucks are standing by for immediate assistance upon landing. The final 30 minutes of flight tested every limit that aircraft and pilot possessed. Fuel gauges dropped toward empty, while Troy nursed 1275 through the air, using every fuel conservation technique that Rebecca had taught him. The aircraft flew with the determination of a machine that understood the importance of its mission. Systems functioning flawlessly despite being pushed far beyond their design specifications. As Nellis Air Force Base appeared in the distance, Troy felt a profound sense of completion. He'd not only proven that 1275 could perform beyond everyone's expectations, but he'd also demonstrated that Rebecca's innovations could save lives under the most demanding conditions possible. Base operations. Rescue 1 has the field in sight. Request priority handling for emergency landing. Rescue 1, you are cleared for immediate approach to runway 09. Outstanding work bringing everyone home safely. The landing was smooth despite 1275's near-empty fuel tanks, and as the aircraft rolled to a stop, Troy could see crowds of personnel waiting to assist the survivors and celebrate the successful completion of a mission that had exceeded everyone's most optimistic hopes. Behind him, 10 people who might have died in the mountains were alive because an old aircraft and an overlooked pilot had proven that potential never truly disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to soar. The crowd that gathered around 1275 as it shut down on the Nellis flight line was unlike anything Troy had experienced in his 20-year military career. Medical personnel rushed to assist the rescued survivors, while ground crews began their assessment of an aircraft that had just completed one of the most demanding missions in base history. Troy remained in the cockpit for several long moments, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Rebecca's voice recording continued to play in his headset, her final message carrying words that seemed specifically chosen for this moment. When you land, remember that every successful flight is a gift that should be shared with those who believed in you. As he climbed down from the aircraft, Troy was immediately surrounded by personnel who wanted to understand how a supposedly obsolete fighter had accomplished what newer aircraft couldn't attempt. But his attention was focused on one small figure breaking through the crowd with determination that reminded him powerfully of her mother. Lily ran across the tarmac with tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from pure joy at seeing her father return safely from a mission that had transformed him from maintenance chief to hero. Troy knelt down to catch her in a hug that contained 8 years of suppressed dreams and newfound purpose. "I knew you could do it," she whispered into his ear. "Mom told me you were the bravest pilot she ever knew, and now everyone else knows it too." Colonel Davidson approached with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal admiration. "Matheson, I've been in the Air Force for 28 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just accomplished. You didn't just save 10 lives, you've proven that innovation and determination can overcome obstacles that defeat conventional thinking." Behind the colonel, Dr. Vaughn was documenting aircraft performance data with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just witnessed the validation of theories she'd spent years developing. "Master Sergeant, your wife's modifications performed flawlessly under extreme conditions. The data we've collected will influence aircraft design and modification programs for decades to come." Major Brennan stepped forward with something Troy had never expected to see: a set of pilot's wings that gleamed with fresh polish. "Matheson, by authority of the United States Air Force and in recognition of exceptional performance under emergency conditions, you are hereby reinstated to active flight status with immediate effect." The presentation ceremony was informal but deeply meaningful, conducted on the flight line beside the aircraft that had made it all possible. As Brennan pinned the wings to Troy's flight suit, Troy could feel Rebecca's presence more strongly than at any time since her death, as if she were standing beside him to witness the moment. When her faith in his abilities was finally validated by official recognition, Hernandez appeared with news that would complete Troy's transformation from maintenance chief to active pilot. "The base commander has approved your assignment as chief test pilot for the Legacy Aircraft Optimization Program. You'll be working with Dr. Vaughn to evaluate and implement improvements to older aircraft throughout the Air Force fleet." The assignment represented everything Troy had dreamed of during his years as a grounded pilot: the opportunity to fly regularly while using his mechanical expertise to improve aircraft performance. More importantly, it would allow him to continue Rebecca's work on a scale that could benefit the entire military aviation community. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Troy found himself alone with 1275 for the first time since the morning's emergency. The aircraft showed signs of its demanding day: minor scuff marks from the challenging landings, slightly elevated engine temperatures from sustained high-power operations, and the satisfied appearance of a machine that had proven its worth under extreme conditions. "You did good today, old girl," Troy murmured, running his hand along the wing that had carried him and 10 other people safely through challenges that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Later that evening, after the survivors had been treated and released, after the initial debriefings had been completed, and after the media attention had finally subsided, Troy and Lily made a quiet journey to the base cemetery where Rebecca's memorial marker stood among those of other military personnel who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Troy placed his old maintenance chief's stripes on the marble surface, replacing them with the pilot's wings that Brennan had presented earlier in the day. It felt like completing a circle that had been broken 8 years earlier, restoring a connection between past dreams and future possibilities. "I kept my promise," he said quietly, speaking to the woman whose innovations had made the day's success possible. "I flew for both of us, and I brought everyone home." Lily placed Rebecca's lucky charm bracelet beside the wings, its metal charms catching the light of the setting sun. "She knew you would," she said, with the absolute certainty that children possess about the important things in life. "She told me that dreams don't die when people do. They just wait for someone who loves them enough to make them real." 6 months later, 1275 sat in a place of honor in the base's aircraft display area, no longer scheduled for decommissioning, but rather designated as the prototype for a fleet-wide aircraft improvement program. A small plaque near the cockpit told the story of its historic rescue mission and credited both Troy and Rebecca for proving that innovation could extend the operational life of older aircraft while improving their performance beyond original specifications. Troy's new office overlooked the flight line, providing a daily view of aircraft taking off and landing with the kind of routine precision that made military aviation possible. His desk contained photographs of Rebecca and Lily, technical manuals for aircraft throughout the Air Force inventory, and the logbook from 1275's rescue mission, a document that had already become legendary within the aviation community. But the most treasured item in his office was Rebecca's flight log, open to the page where she'd written her final entry. Some flights are about reaching destinations, but the most important ones are about discovering what's possible when people refuse to accept limitations imposed by others. Each morning, as Troy prepared for another day of test flights and aircraft evaluations, he would read those words and remember that the best way to honor someone's memory was to continue the work they'd started, to push boundaries they'd identified, and to prove that love could transcend loss when channeled into purpose. The old F-16 had taught him that sometimes the things people throw away still have fight left in them, and sometimes a father's love really can breathe life into what everyone else calls dead. More importantly, it had shown him that dreams deferred are not dreams denied. They're simply dreams waiting for the right moment to soar.